Well, it's been quite the whirlwind month for us Bond fans, hasn't it? After a few years of radio silence regarding the future of the James Bond franchise, 2025 saw the bombshell announcement that Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson, producers of Bond for the last 30 years, would be ceding creative control of the franchise to Amazon. That is, in and of itself, seismic. The first time the Bond films have been outside control of the Broccoli family since the series began in 1962. But the weeks since the announcement have also seen a slew of news regarding the internal pitches for James Bond under Amazon, Broccoli and Wilson's creative differences with the streaming giant, and rumors about future projects. Is Chris Nolan finally going to make his 007 movie? Is Pierce Brosnan coming back for Old Man Bond? There's a lot of noise to cut through, and I have a lot of thoughts, as a longtime Bond fan and as a film scholar. But first, I think we need to lay out a timeline for how we got here. In March of 2022, Amazon purchased MGM for $8.5 billion, acquiring the once legendary movie studio's backlog of films, and more crucially, the rights to create new products out of MGM's intellectual properties. Analysts immediately pegged the James Bond franchise as the crown jewel of this acquisition. MGM had other recognizable IPs and famous blockbusters, but no title as immensely lucrative and endlessly franchisable as James Bond, the series producing over 24 hit films across 60 years. It seemed inevitable that Amazon would immediately make Bond a #1 priority, especially since 2021's No Time to Die had definitively ended the Daniel Craig era, leaving the series naturally in a transitional period. But no news came until December 2024, with reports of creative difficulties between Amazon and Barbara Broccoli. Difficulties which boiled down to Broccoli's desire to keep Bond a film series and Amazon's desire for multimedia expansion. Despite Amazon promising to keep Bond a theatrical film franchise, their pitches to Wilson and Broccoli immediately involved streaming spin-offs. Maybe a Moneypenny show, or a show about Felix Leiter, or a show about a Lady 007. Broccoli was reportedly offended by Amazon referring to James Bond as content, and suggested the streaming company might not actually be a very good fit for Bond. More bluntly, she called Amazon executives f***ing idiots. And that was apparently the final straw for Jeff Bezos, who said, quote, "I don't care how much it costs, get rid of her." And it ended up costing quite a bit. For an extra $1 billion, Amazon has fully wrenched creative control away from Broccoli and Wilson. The pair still have a financial stake in the franchise, but for all practical purposes, their time as the stewards of 007 is over. And I don't think the gravity of that should be understated. For whatever Bond's future holds, 2025 marks the end of the series as a family business. Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson weren't just executives handling a film franchise. They inherited the series from their father/stepfather, Albert Cubby Broccoli, the co-producer who had originated the series in the first place and steered it from the 60s through the 80s. And the kids didn't just take control when Dad got old, they worked their way up through the films. Michael is an assistant to Cubby and co-screenwriter of every Bond film in the 80s, while Barbara first began work on the series as a teenager, working in publicity to assistant director to associate producer, before graduating to co-producer with her half-brother. That sense of a family affair has also been reflected throughout the movies, in both cast and crew. The recurring actors who filled the supporting roles of MI6 maintained more than just continuity as Bonds came and went. The familiar faces of M, Moneypenny, and Q provided a warm feeling of coming home. And while unseen, the recurring services of John Barry and later David Arnold as composers maintained a consistent musical identity for the series that transcended different eras. A lot of crew members carried over between the films, in fact, with even directors like Peter Hunt and John Glenn training their way up as editors and second unit directors on earlier Bond entries. And while the films themselves have been big event movies pretty much since their inception, they've never totally felt at peace with the biggest Hollywood blockbusters. This is partially because they're British productions. films distributed by major US film companies but not strictly controlled by them. But in the early years especially, the films carried a scrappy charm, with cruder special effects and more ramshackle editing than you'd see in the biggest American productions. Certainly, this family feeling has been gradually slipping away long before Amazon entered the picture. US distributor United Artists was swallowed in a corporate merger with MGM in 1981, and it was around the same time that the scrappier aesthetics of the 60s and 70s gave way to a more streamlined competence. Moreover, many of the cast and crew essential to the Bond family slowly fell away over the years to old age and death. The Craig era especially introduced a new era of superstardom. Directors were no longer anonymous craftsmen or series regulars who worked their way up the chain, but major award-winning filmmakers bringing their clout to Bond. The same was true of composers, who went from artists who became part of the Bond family to blockbuster composers who drop in for a spell, do their thing, and peace out. And while the new MI6 team did bring a new batch of familiar faces from film to film, these weren't character actors you only knew from Bond movies. These were world-class celebrities. These changes aren't strictly speaking bad. The baseline competence is part of what has made Bond such a reliable franchise over the years, and for all my criticisms of the Craig era's grasping for prestige filmmaking, I'd be hard-pressed to give up the slick and stylish cinematography of the Sam Mendes films. But I also think a scrappy, independent spirit has slowly ebbed away from the series since the 60s, and that's reached its apex with Amazon taking control, fully eliminating the last vestiges of the family business the Bond films started as. There is no one currently involved with the franchise that you can point to that has built and maintained it, and has connections to its roots. Now James Bond is just another intellectual property for its corporate owners to do with as they wish. The graveyard of abandoned franchises is littered with similar IPs, which lost all human components and became just a title with some associated tropes and trademarks. It's crazy to think that could also be James Bond's fate given its 60-year history, but the series has never been truly rudderless like it is now. Of course, the series is also too big a cash cow to simply disappear. Amazon will no doubt try to keep the series going, and there's been an explosion of rumors following Broccoli and Wilson being bought out. What's more, reports suggest Amazon views Bond as one of the last untapped IP gold mines. Apparently, a consistent drip feed of new films across decades, merchandise tie-ins as far back as the 60s, and corporate synergy with in-film product placement is just scratching the surface. What new content frontier could Bond have left? Why, streaming spin-off shows, of course. That's what Amazon clashed with Barbara Broccoli on, and the company also controls their own streaming platform. Bond has also historically reflected the major trends in franchise filmmaking. And right now, the trend is for big movies to have their universes fleshed out by spin-offs streamed on small screens. Of course, that trend also provides a great counter-argument for why Bond shouldn't go down the spin-off road, as a lot of these shows have actually done more harm than good. Marvel's ongoing flop era was predicated in no small part by overproduction of Disney Plus shows, and subsequent movies being so tied up in TV plot lines that they've slowly become impenetrable unless you have a doctorate in MCU studies. Star Wars basically shifted from a film series to a loosely connected TV universe in less than a decade, and feels all the smaller and unfocused as a result. And these are among the most prolific and popular streaming spin-offs. A lot of shows have received a lot less traction. Like, did you know there's a MonsterVerse TV series called Monarch: Legacy of Monsters streaming on Apple TV Plus, starring Kurt Russell? Yeah, I didn't either. And I'm not even saying the show is bad. It might well be really good for all I know. But it's also indicative of how a highly produced major franchise can suddenly feel small-time and skippable when it's spun off to the ether of streaming. One of James Bond's strengths historically has been its avoidance of this kind of overproduction and devaluing. Every few years a new Bond movie would hit theaters, and at least until the Craig era, there was no prerequisite viewing. You could diligently catch every flick in theaters or drop in and out randomly and basically have the same experience. And while there was technically additional media in the form of video games and cartoons, it was also clearly bonus content that occupied its own space. No one was under the illusion that James Bond Jr. was essential to the lore. It was just fun extras for kids or fans who wanted that extra bit of Bond in their lives, but the focus was always on the films, which, good or bad, always felt like big events. Even the smallest entries always had an action scene or stunt, or even just an alluring and impressive location that felt worthy of the big screen. It's that spectacle, that sense of extraordinary adventure that's at the forefront of Bond's appeal, and is made more ordinary when released weekly on TV, or worse yet, dropped all at once to be binged then discarded. There have of course been some successful streaming spin-off shows, but I'd also argue that your Dune Prophecies or The Penguins, or even Star Wars and Marvel have a much sturdier foundation for expansion than Bond does. The world of 007 is not a dense sci-fi universe or an infinite plane for fantasy adventure. It's basically just a cartoony version of our world that provides a playground for its super spy protagonist. Everything special about the series ties back to him, his adventures, his drink, his theme song. James Bond without James Bond is just a generic spy story. Take, for example, Amazon's proposal of a Felix Leiter spin-off show. Felix is a CIA agent who sometimes helps Bond out in a handful of movies and doesn't really have much of a consistent character beyond being James Bond's friend. So a Felix TV show would basically just be a show about a guy who works for the CIA, something we already have no shortage of. Would a Moneypenny show cover her secretarial duties? No, of course not. It'd almost certainly be a prequel about her adventures as a spy before taking a desk job at MI6. Could you squeeze some fun out of that? Probably, but at that point it barely resembles the character it's named after, so what's the point? Also, unlike Marvel and DC, Bond doesn't have decades of source material to draw upon for expansions. All of the Ian Fleming novels have already been adapted. I guess there technically have been Bond novels written after Fleming, but for the most part they seem to be solo adventures following the Fleming mold, and not particularly helpful for spin-offs. I suspect this is part of what Barbara Broccoli meant when she said Amazon wasn't a good fit for Bond, that the series doesn't loan itself to these kinds of world-building expansions. Conversely, the series does lend itself exceptionally well to continued film adventures, better than almost any other comparable legacy franchise. You don't have to worry about where the universe goes next, or fitting into the existing lore, or what you're gonna do as the lead actor ages out of the part. James Bond has been, from the jump, a repeating formula of international espionage and adventure as a super spy is entangled in the plots of megalomaniacal villains and intrigue with sexy ladies, with the actor at the center endlessly recastable. You don't even really have to worry about updating the series for modern standards. Bond has certainly had to adapt to changing ideas of gender and a post-Cold War world, but the fundamental elements and formula have largely been unchanged since the 60s and still work. I've made this point before, but of the 25 official James Bond movies released across the last 60 years, not a single one has truly flopped in theaters. Some have been bigger hits, some have been modest disappointments, but no Bond movie has ever fallen short of its production budget. Even the frequently delayed and pandemic release No Time to Die still grossed about $800 million worldwide. The inflated marketing costs due to the delays may have technically meant the film underperformed, but that is a hell of a technicality, an unprecedented global crisis that utterly decimated theatrical releases and of which No Time to Die suffered some of the worst consequences. There is no reason to think the series can't continue as the theatrical juggernaut it's been since its inception. No reason except for the vested interests of streamers, to maximize their profits by milking an IP dry, to flood their platforms with more content, and to bypass sharing any revenue with movie theaters. I can cite the franchise's impeccable box office record, or its inherent virtues as a cinematic institution, or the damages streaming spin-offs have done to major franchises until I'm blue in the face. I'm not sure any of it actually makes a difference. So while I have no idea who will be cast next as James, or who will be directing, I do see 4 overarching possibilities for the future of the franchise. Option 1 is a new person or group of people are hired to oversee production of the series, and we get a new Bond movie in theaters every few years, which gets a decent theatrical run before moving to Amazon Prime. This is definitely a long shot given Amazon's expressed interest in streaming Bond content and the generally adversarial attitude streamers tend to have with movie theaters, but this is also, to my eyes, easily the best case scenario. Whether or not the films turn out any good is a different matter, but at least the legacy of James Bond as cinematic institution is preserved. Option 2 is theatrical runs are much shorter, possibly akin to the very brief run Netflix gave Glass Onion, where Bond functionally becomes a streaming exclusive and is joined by a trove of spin-off shows. This is substantially worse, as it lessens Bond and removes the series' spectacular event film status, but at least it's still possible to see the main films in theaters. And if the shows are tangential enough, then a viewer can at least comfortably pick and choose which to watch and which to skip without detracting from the movies. Option 3 is the spin-offs are essential, and Bond becomes a sprawling mess of shared universe lore, fully embracing the sludge of continuity the Craig era was already sliding into. And as bad as that sounds, there is a worse option. After a couple of attempts at film, James Bond shifts into just being a streaming TV show. A series of low-rent spy adventures designed for the small screen, and the image of Bond as cinematic icon passes into memory. As a cinephile, that would basically be a death blow to a series I love. But I wonder how widespread that sentiment is among fellow Bond fans. Would the dads, grandpas, and uncles who occupy the core of Bond's audience mourn the loss of James Bond as a theatrical experience? Or would they be happy to slot in episodes of Bond the TV show at home, in between viewings of Reacher and Yellowstone? The growing decline of the movie theater as a form of film watching is well documented, and Bond might just be the next casualty. And if you're not a Bond fan, you might not think that's such a big deal. But I think this is all much bigger than just Bond. This is a full-blown crisis for cinema itself. We're not talking about how Hollywood won't make movies like Midnight Cowboy anymore. We're talking about James Bond, a macho power fantasy action thrill ride with a formula as bulletproof as Coca-Cola. If the studios can't figure out how to make that work in theaters, and if audiences can't see why that would be worth leaving their homes for, then the movies are in real trouble. And honestly, the more I reflect on all of this, the more I realize it's bigger than movies. That quote from Bezos is so emblematic of a rot in our world, where billionaires are so wealthy they can buy culture. They didn't build it, they didn't maintain it, they don't even understand it, but they have such an obscene amount of money that they get to have it anyway. And now we all get to wait with bated breath to see if this fucking idiot destroys it. I would love to be wrong. I would love for Amazon to continue the series' traditions as a cinematic institution, and thrilling 007 adventures to remain a mainstay of the theater. I would love in a few years' time for viewers to be able to jump into the comments of this video and sarcastically say, "Lol, this aged well." But based on everything we know about streaming platforms, about Amazon, and about the behind-the-scenes drama of the Bond deal, I think the series continuing with anything close to the spirit it had before would be a miracle.